Snow fell silently over the small Wyoming town of Red Ridge the night everything changed. At exactly 2:30 in the morning, someone knocked on Caleb Doss's door. It wasn't a polite knock. 3 hard, urgent strikes. Caleb woke instantly. Years as a former Marine had trained his body never to ignore the sound of danger. He pulled on his jacket, the cold air biting at his skin as he stepped onto the porch. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood there, his face a grim mask in the swirling snowflakes. Behind him, the flashing red and blue lights of his patrol car painted the fresh snow in unsettling colors. "Caleb," the sheriff said, his voice low, "I need you to come with me." Caleb frowned, his senses on high alert. What happened? The sheriff hesitated, his gaze shifting away for just a second. That's complicated. Down by the gate, 2 patrol cars idled, their engines a low hum in the dead of night. He could see curtains twitching in the neighbors' windows. This wasn't a friendly visit. Something was wrong. Very wrong. 10 minutes later, Caleb found himself inside the cold, sterile environment of the county sheriff's station. He stood staring at a photograph placed on a metal table. A burned-out pickup truck, twisted and blackened, found at the edge of Miller Canyon. Inside it, a body. "We believe it's your younger brother, Luke," Sheriff Brooks said, the words hanging in the air. At first, they didn't make sense. Luke couldn't be dead. He just couldn't. Luke had called him only yesterday, his voice buzzing with excitement. He said he'd found something big, something dangerous. Something that went to the very heart of Red Ridge itself. "What kind of accident was it?" Caleb asked, his own voice sounding distant, foreign. The sheriff didn't answer right away. He just looked at the photograph. Because it wasn't an accident. The truck was riddled with bullet holes. Luke had been digging into something. A series of illegal land purchases happening quietly, almost invisibly, all around the valley. Ranches bought overnight for cash. Families pressured into selling their heritage for pennies on the dollar. Someone was taking Red Ridge piece by piece, and Luke had found the proof. But now, that proof was missing, along with Luke's phone and his laptop. Caleb drove home just before sunrise, a cold, hard anger beginning to replace the initial shock. His brother wasn't reckless. He wasn't a drunk. If Luke died, it was because someone wanted him silent. As he pulled into the long driveway of his family's ranch, his headlights caught something that shouldn't have been there. Tire tracks. Fresh ones, cutting through the new snow. Leading not to the house, but straight toward the old barn. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from his truck and stepped inside the barn slowly. The familiar scent of hay and old wood doing nothing to calm his nerves. The barn lights flickered erratically. And there, hanging from a wooden support post, was Luke's favorite jacket. It was covered in dark, dried blood. His heart pounded in his chest. But then he saw it. Scratched into the wood beneath the jacket, carved with a knife, were 3 words. "Don't trust Brooks." Caleb's entire world tilted. Sheriff Brooks. The man in charge of the investigation. The man who had just told him his brother was dead. Suddenly, headlights swept across the wide barn entrance, blinding him for a moment. A black SUV, windows tinted, had stopped just outside. Its engine was running, watching, waiting. Caleb instinctively stepped back into the shadows. After a long moment, the SUV slowly pulled away, disappearing back down the driveway. Whoever it was, they knew he was here. They knew he'd found the message. By morning, the story was already all over town. Luke Dawson, drunk driving, tragic accident, case closed. It was too fast. Too neat. Too clean. Caleb went to the only diner in Red Ridge, the place Luke used to grab coffee every single morning. The moment he walked in, conversations stopped. The young waitress, Sarah, froze when she saw him, her face pale. As she poured his coffee, she leaned in close. "You should leave town, Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Her hands shook as she placed the coffee cup down. "Because Luke was asking the same questions you're about to start asking." Outside, as he walked back to his truck, Caleb noticed something that made his blood run cold. A brand new, professionally printed for sale sign had been planted in the ground across 3 neighboring ranches. Ranchas that had been in the same families for generations, and at the bottom of the sign, in bold letters, "Owned by Frontier Development Group." He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he searched public records. He found the company registry in minutes. Owner listed, Daniel Brooks Holdings, the sheriff's name. At that moment, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Bottom of the sign, in bold letters, "Owned by Frontier Development Group." He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he searched public records. He found the company registry in minutes. Owner listed, Daniel Brooks Holdings, the sheriff's name. At that moment, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. As he turned toward his truck, a sharp crack echoed across the quiet main street. A rifle shot. The passenger side window of his truck exploded, glass showering the seat where he would have been sitting in just a few more seconds. He dove behind an old water trough, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a warning anymore. Someone was actively hunting him. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing Red Ridge in a false sense of peace. And as Caleb crouched in the freezing cold, he finally understood the terrifying truth. His brother had died trying to save their town. Now it looked like the town, or the people running going to run. He was going to fight back. Thank you for watching. If you want to follow Caleb's journey for justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the Red Ridge conspiracy. They forgot he was a Marine, and he wasn't going to run. He was going to fight back. Thank you for watching. If you want to follow Caleb's journey for justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the Red Ridge conspiracy. We'll see you in the next one. Snow began falling again over Red Ridge, a soft, silent blanket that did little to quiet the storm brewing inside Caleb Dawson. As he stood there, watching the flakes drift down, he understood something deeply unsettling. His brother, Luke, hadn't simply died in a tragic accident. Someone wanted the questions to stop. And now, Caleb was the one asking them. The cold wind snaked its way down Main Street as Caleb leaned against his truck, trying to steady his thoughts. The town looked just as he remembered it, almost painfully normal. Lights glowed warmly in the diner windows, cars were parked quietly along the road, and the old clock tower stood silent guard. But something felt fundamentally different. He could feel it in the air, a tension that wasn't there before. People were watching him. He saw curtains shift in windows as he passed. Conversations would hush the moment he entered a room. Red Ridge, the town he grew up in, suddenly felt claustrophobic, smaller than it had ever been. As Caleb turned to get back into his truck, a loud, sharp cracking sound echoed through the street. He whipped his head around just in time to see the diner window fracture, a spiderweb of cracks spreading across the glass. Customers inside jumped, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Everyone looked around, trying to figure out what had just happened. But Caleb felt a different kind of chill run through him, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard realization. Someone wanted to send a message, to get his attention without a direct confrontation, a warning without a single word spoken. He climbed into his truck and drove away slowly, the fresh snow already covering his tracks. For a fleeting moment, a pair of distant headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, bright and unblinking. Then, just as suddenly, they turned off onto a side street and vanished. A coincidence? Maybe, but Caleb was quickly learning that he no longer believed in coincidences. Not here, not anymore. He needed to think, to get away from the prying eyes of Main Street. He drove to the old, abandoned grain warehouse just outside of town, a place where the uneasy silence of Red Ridge was replaced by the simple quiet of the countryside. Only a handful of people knew he was coming home today. Even fewer knew he was here to look into Luke's death. One warning, a cryptic message from an old friend, refused to leave his mind. Don't trust Brooks. Sheriff Daniel Brooks, the man who was supposed to uphold the law in this town. Caleb pulled out his phone, his fingers numb from the cold, and dialed a number he knew by heart. He needed to talk to someone Luke had trusted more than anyone. Emma Collins. When Emma opened her apartment door, she did it carefully, peeking through the crack first. A wave of relief washed over her face when she saw it was him, but it was quickly replaced by a deep-seated worry. "You shouldn't stay long, Caleb," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper as she pulled him inside. He gave a wry, tired smile. "That obvious, huh?" She didn't answer, just quickly locked the door and pulled the blinds shut, plunging the small apartment into a dim, secure twilight. Her kitchen table was a chaotic map of his brother's last days. It was covered in documents, property maps of the county, stacks of town records, and pages of handwritten timelines. Luke's investigation was laid out right here. He believed something was changing in Red Ridge, Emma explained, her voice low and urgent. Something big. He noticed families who've lived here for generations were suddenly selling their land. Longtime ranchers, people who would never leave, were packing up and moving away without any real explanation. Caleb leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the maps. He saw a pattern emerging. Nearly every property that had been sold formed a ring around the town center. And they were all purchased by the same entity, a company called Frontier Development Group. He flipped through the official paperwork, the deeds and transfer documents, and beneath each one, the same signature appeared again and again, approving the sales. Sheriff Daniel Brooks. A frown creased Caleb's forehead. The warning echoed in his mind. "The land itself is valuable," Emma continued, choosing her words with extreme care. But Luke found something else. He discovered geological survey reports, old ones that most people had forgotten about. They showed rare natural resources, significant deposits, deep beneath the valley. This wasn't just about ranch land anymore. This was about energy companies, about powerful investors, about the promise of massive future profits. Luke hadn't stumbled upon a small-town secret. He had uncovered a multi-million-dollar ambition. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle slowing down outside the building made them both freeze. Headlights swept across the drawn blinds, lingered for a long, tense moment, and then moved on. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and lowered her voice even further. Town officials have been visiting people lately. The sheriff, his deputies, just asking questions, they say. Making sure everyone feels cooperative. Her tone made the words sound like a threat. As if on cue, a calm, measured knock sounded at the apartment door. Neither of them moved. They just stood there, listening to the sound of their own breathing. Emma, a familiar voice called from the hallway. Sheriff Brooks. Just checking in. Heard you had a visitor. His tone was perfectly friendly, professional, completely normal. Emma moved silently to the back of the apartment, her eyes locking with Caleb's. She quietly slid open the rear window that led to a rickety old fire escape. You need to find what Luke hid, she whispered, her words barely audible. Whatever it is, it's the key. Find it. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. He swung a leg over the windowsill and stepped onto the cold, metal stairs as the frigid night air wrapped around him. He heard Emma call out, her voice now steady and composed. Just a minute, Sheriff. Inside, the conversation began moments later. He could hear the calm, measured voices discussing routine town matters. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. It was just a friendly check-in. It was authority quietly reminding everyone who was in charge, who managed the situation here. From the darkness of the alley below, Caleb watched as police vehicles arrived a few minutes later, their blue and red lights reflecting peacefully against the falling snow. There was no urgency, no sirens. It was all very calm. By morning, explanations would spread through the town like wildfire. Stories would be told, narratives would settle, and most people would accept them without a second thought. That's how this kind of control worked. Not through overt force, but through the illusion of certainty. An hour later, Caleb stood on the high ridge overlooking Red Ridge. The town lights glowed warmly beneath a fresh blanket of snow. It looked so peaceful from up here, a perfect postcard of small-town America. But he knew what was churning just beneath that calm surface. Down below, he could see Sheriff Brooks moving confidently among his officers, guiding their activity with calm, practiced assurance. Everything looked organized, methodical, planned. Luke must have realized this before he died. He must have known they were closing in, which meant he would have hidden the proof, the real evidence, somewhere they would never think to look. Somewhere personal, somewhere safe. And as the snow continued to fall, Caleb finally knew where he had to go. The ranch, home. He turned his back on the deceptive glow of the town and started toward the mountains, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time since he'd arrived, he had a clear direction. Behind him, Red Ridge rested quietly under the winter sky. But beneath its calm streets, the truth was still waiting. And this time, Caleb intended to find it. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. The snow fell heavier, a thick white curtain dropping across the mountain road. My tires bit into the fresh powder as I steered the old truck towards the family ranch, a place I hadn't seen in years. The headlights cut a lonely path through the darkness, and with every mile, memories of my brother Luke flooded my mind. His laughter, his stubborn arguments, the way he understood this land better than anyone. Then, through the swirling flakes, the ranch gate appeared ahead. Swinging slowly in the wind, like a tired old ghost. The property felt abandoned. The porch lights, usually a beacon of welcome, remained dark. I parked the truck as quietly as I could, the engines rumbled dying into a profound silence that seemed to own the entire valley. Stepping out, the frozen ground crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the winter night. The barn stood in deep shadow, a familiar silhouette against the storm. I pushed the heavy door open, its groan echoing a feeling of loss that had settled deep in my bones. Inside, the air was still and cold, and there it was. Luke's old denim jacket, still hanging on a hook by the door, just where he always left it. My gaze drifted to the wooden support posts nearby, a spot I knew all too well. I ran my fingers over the carving, the letters rough under my touch. The warning remained, just as he'd left it. Don't trust Brooks. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around carefully, scanning the familiar clutter of the barn. Luke was a planner. He never did anything without a reason, without a backup. If he left a warning, he would have left the reason why. The answer had to be here, somewhere. My eyes swept the floor, finally landing on a section of loose floorboards near the far wall. One corner looked different. Scuffed, as if it had been moved recently. I knelt down, the cold seeping through the knees of my jeans. My fingers found the edge, and the board lifted easily, without a sound. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space, was a small metal box. A fine layer of dust and hay covered its surface. With a shaky breath, I lifted it out and pried the lid open. Inside, a collection of flash drives and papers lay neatly organized. The first things I saw were property maps, the same ones I'd seen in Sheriff Brooks' office, marked with annotations in Luke's familiar scrawl. On top of everything was a stack of notes, his final words to me, to anyone who would listen. I began to read, the words on the page, illuminated by the faint light from my phone. Luke had documented everything. He hadn't just suspected something was wrong. He had proven it. The papers explained step by step how land transfers were being manipulated, how generational ranchos were being quietly pushed into financial ruin. He had outlined the financial connections between Brooks and the out-of-state developers, revealing hidden partnerships that no one in Red Ridge knew existed. He described the subtle pressure tactics used on the town council and local businesses, a campaign of whispers and false promises. There were no wild accusations, no angry tirades. It was all just facts. Cold, hard evidence he had gathered to protect this valley, to protect our home. Suddenly, I understood his plan. He wasn't going to start a fight or a confrontation he knew he couldn't win. He was smarter than that. He chose to fight with the one weapon no one could argue with, the truth. As the first hint of morning light began to filter through the barn's dusty windows, The snow outside finally started to slow. A new sense of purpose burned away the uncertainty that had haunted me for days. I drove back toward town, the box of evidence sitting securely on the passenger seat. My destination wasn't the sheriff's office. It was the local newspaper. I stopped outside the small brick building, and a young journalist, Emma's colleague, opened the door, surprised to see anyone out this early after the storm. Without much explanation, I handed him the box. "This is from Luke Dawson," I said. "It's everything." He took it, and as he and Emma began to review the documents, I saw the recognition dawn on their faces. They understood the gravity of what they held. The verification process began immediately, with quiet phone calls and cross-references. Within hours, the story started to spread. Not like a wildfire, but like a slow, steady current moving through Red Ridge. People gathered in small groups at the diner, at the post office. Longtime ranchers, folks who had been here for generations, read the initial reports together, their faces grim. The suffocating silence that had hung over the valley began to break, replaced by hushed conversations and pointed questions. The pressure mounted, and finally, town officials had no choice but to call a public meeting. The community hall filled quickly that evening. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. I stood near the back, just another face in the crowd, watching. Then, Sheriff Brooks arrived. He walked in with his usual calm demeanor, but as he moved through the room, the conversations didn't stop. All attention shifted toward him. One of the journalists stood at the front and began to present the verified reports. The land agreements were explained openly, the complex legal jargon translated for everyone to understand. The developers' true plans for the valley were clarified, and the potential community impact the loss of ranching. The influx of tourism that would change the town's very soul was discussed honestly for the first time. I saw concerned looks exchanged between neighbors who had been pitted against each other. The fog of confusion and misinformation was finally lifting, replaced by the sharp clarity of transparency. In the face of the undeniable evidence, the town council announced that an independent state review would be launched immediately. All future development decisions were paused indefinitely. In that moment, the town began the slow, painful process of reconsidering everything. Control, once held so tightly by a powerful few, was quietly changing hands, returning to the community itself. In the days that followed, Red Ridge felt different. The for sale signs started to come down. Ranch signs, proud family names carved into wood, remained standing. Families who had been on the verge of leaving decided to stay, to fight for the future they wanted, not the one being forced upon them. The valley, blanketed in melting snow, looked peaceful again. A week later, I went back out to the ranch. Near the barn, where Luke had made his last stand, I installed a small, wooden marker. I'd carved it myself. It read, "Luke Dawson, Protector of Red Ridge." The wind moved gently across the open fields, a soft whisper through the pines. Later, I went back out to the ranch. Near the barn, where Luke had made his last stand, I installed a small, wooden marker. I'd carved it myself. It read, "Luke Dawson, Protector of Red Ridge." The wind moved gently across the open fields, a soft whisper through the pines. As the sunrise lit the mountains in strokes of gold, I stood and watched the town below. For the first time in a long, long time, Red Ridge felt like it belonged to its people again.